This is Brittney, and this is her airplane on the roof of a building after she crashed when she was moments away from landing. This was a heartbreaking tragedy, and the investigation that followed would uncover several shocking details about how this happened, and that's why I'm going to share with you the full story and the real mistake that got Brittney killed. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your pilot debrief. Our story begins on the morning of April 13th, 2022 in Salt Lake City when Brittney was getting ready to make a routine flight to the Burley Municipal Airport in Idaho. She had flown into the Burley Airport 12 times already that year, but tragically this flight would be her last. On the day of the accident, she completed one instrument approach, and then when she came back around for a second, something went terribly wrong. Video footage captured her aircraft in a nose-high attitude as it crashed into one of the exhaust stacks on the roof of a building, killing her instantly. The question is why, and to answer that, we need to start by looking at the pilot. Brittney was only 30 years old when she died. She earned her private pilot certificate while she was still in high school and graduated as a valedictorian of her class in 2010. She would go on to obtain a degree in business finance from Utah State University in 2018 and started flying full-time the following year, becoming a commercial pilot and certified flight instructor at a flight school in Arizona. In early 2020, when COVID happened, she moved back home to Idaho and began working as a pilot for a cargo company called Jim Air. The aircraft she was flying for them when she crashed was a 2013 Cessna 208B Caravan. This is a high-wing aircraft typically capable of carrying 9 passengers, but it's also used for cargo purposes, which is how it was being used on the day of the crash. According to the investigation, the aircraft was heavily loaded, but it was still within the weight and balance limits for the flight. When it comes to Brittney's experience in this aircraft, she started flying the Caravan in November of 2021 and passed her proficiency, instrument, and line checks in February of 2022, just 2 months prior to the crash. Brittney had almost 1,400 hours of total flight time, and she logged almost 200 hours in the Caravan. Now, the NTSB never said how much total instrument time Brittney had, but according to her flight logs with Jim Air, she had about 26 hours of flight time and instrument conditions in the Caravan. However, only about 2 hours of that was logged between the time she passed her check ride in February and the accident almost 2 months later. The reason this is important is because even though she was a well-respected pilot and was always careful, she didn't have a lot of experience flying the Caravan in bad weather conditions, and this was just one of the factors that contributed to the crash. Unfortunately, the Caravan that Brittney was flying didn't have a cockpit voice recorder or a flight data recorder because they weren't required. Eventually, the NTSB determined that there was nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft, but one of the big factors they needed to consider was the weather. On the morning of the accident, the weather at the Burley Airport was forecast to be VFR conditions with cloud ceilings around 2,600 feet and 6 miles visibility. The only problem was the flight up from Salt Lake City was estimated to take 1 hour and 7 minutes, and during that time, there was a weather system moving through the area. When Brittney began her first approach, the weather had deteriorated to a 2,300-foot ceiling and visibility of only 1 mile due to light snow with a temperature of -3 degrees Celsius. One of the problems with the weather is that it meant Brittney would be flying in icing conditions. Although the aircraft was equipped with a TKS ice protection system, there were still certain restrictions that Brittney needed to be aware of. One of those limitations, according to the aircraft manual, was that she was required to maintain a minimum airspeed of 95 knots in icing conditions when the flaps are up. When flying an approach in icing conditions, the flaps should be set to 10 degrees and no more than 20 degrees with a minimum airspeed of 85 knots. We'll talk more about this later when we look at what happened during the approach. For now, the important thing you need to know is that the investigation determined that there was no evidence of icing on the aircraft, and icing did not play a role in the crash. That said, Brittney was still concerned about icing because she didn't want to get stuck in Burley. The airport is uncontrolled, and they don't have any de-icing equipment on the ground, and that's why her company policy recommended flying a low pass over the runway whenever necessary to assess the airfield conditions. In fact, she tried to land at Burley the day prior, but due to ground icing, she had to divert to Twin Falls just a short distance away. The truth is, her company never pressured any of their pilots to land at Burley, and diverting to Twin Falls was a very common practice, especially whenever there was bad weather. When Brittney got about 20 miles from the field, she checked in with the approach controller and was told to expect the RNAV approach to runway 20, and that brings us to the first approach. This is the RNAV GPS approach to runway 20, and the weather met the minimum requirements that Brittney needed to fly the approach. However, when you only have 1 mile visibility, it's going to be difficult to see the runway. And one of the other challenges is that this is a non-precision approach, meaning there's no vertical guidance for the pilot to follow to descend down to the runway. And that's because it has a 3.75 degree visual descent angle for the final segment of the approach, which is steeper than the normal 3-degree path found on most precision approaches. The reason why this approach is steeper than normal is because of the exhaust vent stacks on the roof of the processing plant located across the river about 2,600 feet from the end of the runway. Basically, they're too high to allow pilots to fly a normal 3-degree path to the runway, and I'm going to show you the measurements later of just how close they are to the aircraft that fly overhead. For right now, unfortunately, there isn't much on this approach plate to warn pilots about these stacks. There's a little symbol on the side showing an obstacle at an elevation of 4,179 feet MSL, but it doesn't say these are sticking up 100 feet above the ground right in line with the runway. The other thing that's different about this approach plate is this section down at the bottom. If you can fly a normal 3-degree path to the runway, then the chart will look something like this with a gray shaded area that's known as a stipple. However, if an obstacle interferes with that 3-degree path, then the gray area is removed from the chart. Now I know it might seem a bit backwards because our brain tells us that we should highlight things that are different or that might be a problem, but that's just the way the approach plates are made. Thankfully, Brittney had flown into Burley 12 times so far that year, and that means she's likely seen the exhaust stacks before and was aware of how close they are to the runway and knew that they're a dangerous obstacle on this approach. According to the ADS-B data, during the first approach, Brittney maintained a relatively constant 3.75 degree path from about 6,800 feet all the way down to the runway. She flew that approach with the flaps up at an airspeed of about 130 knots, which was well above the minimum airspeed for having the flaps up, and she probably did that so she wouldn't have to worry about any icing accumulating on the flaps. She got below the clouds right around 2,300 feet above the ground, but because of the snow limiting the visibility to 1 mile, she most likely didn't see the runway until she was right at her minimum descent altitude of 4,560 feet. Once you get below the MDA, it's a visual approach, and that means you're responsible for obstacle clearance, and if you lose sight of the runway, you're supposed to execute a missed approach. The investigation couldn't determine if Brittney was using the autopilot during either approach, but the one thing we know for certain was that she stayed on that 3.75 degree path on the approach, and that red line represents the exhaust stacks that she flew directly over. Now, she continued her descent, and the airport surveillance video showed her crossing the runway threshold 20 feet high as she assessed the airfield conditions before increasing the power and climbing away to execute the missed approach procedure. Before we look at what happened during her second approach, we need to talk about how dangerous the exhaust stacks are. The Gem State Processing Facility is located on the east side of the Snake River across from the Burley Airport. And as a side note, Gem State Processing is not related to Gem Air, the company that Brittney was flying for. Now, when it comes to the processing plant, the investigation didn't say when it was built, but we know that the airport was there first, and the city owns the land where the processing facility is located, and they lease it to them. In March of 2016, over 6 years prior to this tragedy, the Burley Airport manager told the FAA that Gem State was building new exhaust stacks on their property, and he believed they wanted to make all the stacks 100 feet high, and he wanted to know if they had permission to do that. The FAA responded saying they didn't have any information about that, and when the FAA contacted Gem State, they were told the stacks were 60 feet high and 4 more stacks were being built. It was around that same time that Southern Idaho pilots were trying to warn officials that the stacks presented a safety concern, and the city administrator at the time claimed that Gem State never told the city or the county about making the stacks bigger. According to a lawsuit filed by Brittney's parents, the city was allegedly aware of the plans regarding the exhaust stacks, but a city official told the FAA in 2015 they weren't a hazard, and the reason he said this was because of the economic benefit the expansion would bring to the city. That right there to me is probably one of the most shocking things I found in this investigation. Now, the FAA eventually got more involved, and they published a study in May of 2016 saying that the height of the stacks was 70 feet above ground level, and they were presumed to be a hazard to air navigation. Around that same time, Gem State modified their plan because they needed to increase the height of the stacks in order to comply with EPA guidelines. The FAA said the first study they did was just a preliminary finding, and they conducted a second study based on the revised plan with the taller stacks. That second study was published in February 2017, and it said the new stacks were now 100 feet tall, but they no longer presented a hazard to air navigation. The FAA required the stacks to be painted with orange and white aviation paint and lit with red obstruction lights. Additionally, any failure or malfunction of one of those lights for more than 30 minutes needed to be reported immediately to the FAA. This is an example of how the stacks should have been painted, and this is a photo taken right after the accident, reflecting that over 5 years after the FAA study, the stacks still hadn't been painted in accordance with the requirement. You can also see that one of the lights wasn't working, but the investigation didn't provide any details on when or if that had been reported to the FAA as required. The stack that Brittney hit also wasn't painted orange and white, and the FAA couldn't determine whether the light on top was functioning prior to the crash. And honestly, my opinion is that it doesn't matter if that light was working or not if you can't see it because of the steam clouds the stacks are producing. On the day that Brittney was flying, you had low ceilings and low visibility, and the winds were straight down the runway, meaning it was blowing the steam directly towards Brittney on the approach path that she was flying. If you look at this video taken from an eyewitness just moments after the crash, you can see the steam blowing towards the stack that Brittney hit, basically obscuring parts of the stack at times. We'll talk more about these exhaust stacks later, but you have to keep in mind that Brittney flew that first approach on that 3.75 degree path right over the top of these stacks without any problems. Now that brings us to what happened on her second approach, and then I'll explain the real mistake that got her killed. By the time Brittney began her second approach, the weather at the field was rapidly improving. Just 8 minutes after her crash, the ceiling was reported to be 3,000 feet, and the visibility had also improved to 2.5 miles. These are much better conditions than her first approach. However, there's still a light snowfall, and it's still icing conditions, and that meant that Brittney should have been flying the approach with the flaps at 10 or 20 degrees. Unfortunately, she kept the flaps up, just like on that first approach, and this is going to be a big factor in what happened next. She got established on the 3.75 degree path to the runway, but this time she was at least 25 knots slower than the first approach, and she eventually would slow down all the way to 85 knots and maintained 85 knots for the last 30 seconds of her flight. Another problem with flying this approach with the flaps up at 85 knots is the nose of the aircraft is higher than it would be if she had the flaps down. Based on her height and nominal eye position, this simulation shows the location of the exhaust stacks, and the gray shaded area represents the instrument panel, and this is what she would have seen at 40 seconds prior to impact. At 30 seconds before impact, the runway is still in view, but the exhaust stack became hidden behind the instrument panel, and it would remain hidden from her view until about 3 seconds prior to impact, but by then it was too late to do anything. However, that doesn't explain how she got low enough to hit it when she was easily able to avoid it on the first approach. This drawing provided by the NTSB gives us a very clear picture of how the approach works. If you're at 4,800 feet at JMID on this approach, which is the lowest you're allowed to be at that point, and if you maintain a 3.75 degree path all the way to the runway, you'll be 40 feet in the air when you cross the displaced runway threshold. That's perfectly fine, but that vertical path only gives you 98 feet of clearance above the exhaust stack that Brittney crashed into. That's not a lot of room for error, but now here's the really interesting part. And I want to thank Juan Brown with the YouTube channel Blanca Lirio for pointing this out, but I also want to thank the folks at the NTSB because they put a tremendous amount of effort into analyzing what happened in this tragedy, and they rarely get the thanks they deserve for what they do, so thank you for all of this. According to the investigation, the last ADSB data point is right here, and I've labeled that point J, and that's where Brittney was at an altitude of 4,387 feet MSL, and she was still on the 3.75 degree path. Her ground speed was 100 knots, and that means she was descending at 450 to 512 feet per minute. That's a nice stabilized approach. The problem is when she gets to point J, that's 1,014 feet laterally from the exhaust stack, and based on the height that she hit the stack, Brittney's rate of descent had to increase to about 1,500 feet per minute in the last few seconds of her flight, which was about 3 times the descent rate she had been flying up to that point. The question is, how did that happen, and what was the real mistake that got her killed? According to a witness and what was seen in the surveillance video, after Brittney came out of the clouds, she immediately went through a steam cloud before hitting the stack that killed her. The NTSB considered the possibility that the steam from those clouds increased the density altitude of the air that Brittney flew through, and that degraded her aircraft performance. However, after extensive analysis, they said this wasn't a factor in the crash because studies showed the density altitude of the steam cloud matched the surrounding air once it got about 200 feet away. Keep in mind that if you're on that 3.75 degree path, you're only going to be about 100 feet above those stacks when you fly over them. And in my opinion, the problem caused by the steam is more than just a density altitude issue. It's the disruption of the air in and around that steam that could cause turbulence or momentary loss of lift. This wouldn't have been a problem on the first approach because Brittney was doing about 120 knots, well above the margin for stalling, and the faster speed would have resulted in the nose being lower and she probably could more easily see the exhaust stacks. However, according to the NTSB, when she flew that second approach at 85 knots, that put her in the regime where the stall warning horn might have activated. So I think it's possible the steam clouds could have affected her aircraft performance, but I also think she could have heard the stall warning horn and simply pushed the nose forward to recover, not realizing the exhaust stack was directly in front of her. Unfortunately, we'll never know for certain what caused Brittney to lose altitude so quickly during the last few seconds of her flight. The NTSB said the probable cause was that she got too low on the approach and the exhaust stacks were a hidden danger. In my opinion, as heartbreaking as this tragedy was, the real pilot mistake that got Brittney killed was simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time when all the holes in the Swiss cheese lined up. And if those exhaust stacks hadn't been there, then Brittney would most likely still be alive today. And my heart goes out to her family and friends as they continue to search for answers. If you learned something from this debrief, be sure to let me know in the comments below and check out one of these other videos on the screen, and I'll see you on the next debrief.